G'day. Technically, I'd like to introduce folks at Bells to the Reverend Willie Liebenberg. Now, I need to check pronunciation because when you're a South African, it's Willie, but I always feel like I should just say Willie. I don't know. What do you prefer?
The South African language, and specifically Afrikaans, you talk because the W there is pronounced a V. So that is why it's Willie in the Afrikaans language. But obviously, if you look at the English language, William, Will, Willie, that's where we go. I'm quite okay with anything at the, I said I live in Australia. Some call me Bill. Some even Bill.
Well, there's a couple of folks here at Bells who've already met you. The Hindmarshes were down at Pittsworth a few weeks ago for worship and enjoyed that no end at all. So we feel like there's a little bit of a connection with you folks.
Yep, that's wonderful.
Well, Willie was one of the guys who helped put together our series of Lent stuff. And so it seemed a very good opportunity. And by the way, g'day from Newcastle from me. But to talk through his reflection for this week, week number 2 in Lent. And the passage is a fascinating one because I think many of us think about the gospel, the good news, as being, well, it's very much for me. It's between me and God, and that's a good thing. That's why it's good news. But it is so much more than that. And maybe we need to get a grip on that in the way Jesus would have had us think about it. So you chose Mark's version of the Great Commission, where Matthew says, as you go out into the whole world, tell people what you know. Mark says, tell the good news to the whole creation. Wow. Take us somewhere with that.
Well, that's the reason why I selected the Mark reading, because of that part that says, take that good news to the whole creation. And it really blew my mind because I had to sit down and work out to myself, what does it really mean when I take out the message to the whole creation? Do I take it out to dogs and birds and my cats and all of that? Or what does it actually mean? And, doing a bit of research on that, I come to realize that obviously Mark speaks from his context, and the context was at that point of time of when Mark lived, when he wrote that passage, you take it to the Gentiles, you take it to the Jewish nation, you take it to whoever live around Jerusalem and around Asia Minor, and that will become the whole creation. So, but then one of the writers went a bit further and say, yeah, if we are such good Christians and we want to change our footprint in this world, surely then creation forms part. When we talk about how do we save the trees, how do we save the forests, all of that becomes then when Mark says, let's take this message of good news to all creation. This writer then suggests that it goes literally to all creation, which in many ways can create problems for people who think a little bit with blinkers on instead of allowing the spirits to be open and actually see. When Mark said that, he was passionate that the good news go to all creation. And so for me, it is back to the thing of who is, if I ask you today, Phil, what does your whole creation look like at Bells? I think that's what I'm trying to say. Your community. What's the community? What's that community look like? All the world in that community.
Okay, there's a bunch of things.
There's lots of stuff
there, really, and I'm going to start with. I'm sort of going to flip back a little bit, then I'll come and try and answer your questions. But I think the other thing about this whole creation that often strikes me is if we are people who read the whole Bible, in a sense of that big narrative, that from the creation, from the beginning, God has loved the whole cosmos, created it and made it good. And in the Psalms, we're told that it sings his praise and it serves to, Paul says it serves to point us towards him. So maybe it is And then we come to, you know, the end of all things, where there is a new heaven and a new earth, and everything is renewed and redeemed. So this good news of what Jesus has done and who Jesus is really does have an impact on the whole creation.
Right.
We last week, one of the things we spoke about with the passage, discipleship drives us into community. Yep. So that becomes a picture of something that's more like the world. And then, you know, we come to this, the whole creation, that this following Jesus business is big picture as much as it is just for us. So what does it look like for us at Bells? Well, it's funny because of the rains and the flooding and stuff, we didn't clean up Australia last weekend. The folks did it this morning.
Okay.
So for us, there is a sense in which, how do we share the good news beyond just talking about it amongst ourselves when we're together on Sundays or on Monday evenings at the Hindies, or when we get together for prayer Tuesday morning or whatever? Yeah. So for us, that question is something like, how do we team up with our neighbourhood to do Clean Up Australia Day? How do we partner with Urban Angels to provide some meals to people in need, a couple of hundred each month? How do we, you know, how else do we touch other churches and live in good partnerships and relationships with them? So I think that sense of finding out as a disciple what it means for me to follow Jesus, but within, as you say, that wider context. Jesus is always moving along with a bunch of his followers going somewhere in his space.
Yeah.
How do you hear the Lent story in that, as he goes from the Galilee and then on toward Jerusalem and on toward eternity? That's good news, big news.
Yeah. Well, if I go back to the devotion, because I mean, that's where I got my Lent, motivation from. I think that theme, I just don't have it in front of me right now, but it says, where do we play? And for me, sometimes as disciples, we are challenged to play outside the environment that we are so comfortable with. You know, that old cliche of, I'm in my comfort zone, don't move me, please. You know, for me, and what I write about Lent on that is, for me, the journey, my story was the journey that Jesus on that road, on this meeting the whole creation, knew that he's going to enter territory that he's never been in, the unfamiliar territory of death on the cross. What will be the result of that be? Now, people say, oh, he was God. He knew he's going to be raised from the dead. But he was human too. So what did the human part in him says? Is there a resurrection? So he moved. He had to go and play in unfamiliar territory. And I think for me, that's the Lent call, is that as disciples, Lent, I need to go into the world and not sit back and say, what can I give up? But what can I rather give? So for me, it's not about giving up things. For me, it's rather, what can I give? What can I give to people? Yes, in some ways, I give up my time. I give up food. But it's the giving part. I move in unfamiliar territory where people are going to look funny at me and saying, what are you doing, mate? This is not how we do it. And I think that's the challenge for me of the cross, and that forms part of Lent.
That's interesting, that idea of unfamiliar territory, and that the gospel would take us there. I'm just struck by the idea that the good news, the gospel, is unfamiliar territory, because in it we hear things like, God doesn't hate you. God isn't some nasty old, God loves you. Yeah. And people would go, that's completely unfamiliar to me. There is a God that you can know personally, not just some abstract spirituality. That's unfamiliar territory for many people. And I think even for those of us who say we are beginning to follow Jesus, there's some really unfamiliar stuff in this that we might, as we play this game of discipleship in new places, we might discover some very unfamiliar things. So instead of being people who critique others, and judge and condemn them.
Yep.
The unfamiliar territory for us might be to offer blessing, to love unconditionally, and to just sit and listen. And I think some of the circumstances we find ourselves in at the moment, whether that's the aftermath of flooding, whether it's a horrid war in Europe, whether it's whatever's going on with this pandemic, endemic thing, you know, how do we play in what are unfamiliar? It's not home ground. And Jesus might be saying to us, there are some new ways for you to play in new places as you are disciples who follow me.
Yeah. And Phil, I want to add to that by saying, for me, it was familiar territory when I read Matthew 28. But it was unfamiliar territory when I read Mark, because he speaks about all creation. Where do you get that from? And I think that for me is, even as disciples, I don't think we ever can claim we have now reached the pinnacle of discipleship. I think we will always learn, disciple, learn, disciple, learn, disciple, because I think when we stop learning, I think we're in trouble. And so for me, that was just those two verses, the familiar and the unfamiliar, just like, whoa, all right, I better get back into this thing. So it was exciting for me.
Willie Liebenberg, Reverend Willie Liebenberg, is with us from Pittsworth on the Downs, and we're talking through this week 2. He's the bloke behind the reflection, this idea of where do we play? Yeah. And I think there's that unfamiliar territory thing. It cuts right to a bugbear that I have, and the people of Bells may well be jack of my banging on about it. But we have a comfort in going to church.
Yeah,
we're okay with being disciples, you know, in a certain place at a certain time, doing a certain kind of thing. And I'm true for that as much as anybody else. What is it for me to be a disciple and to play this game with my family? You know, my dad, bless him, often said, you know, the hardest people to share your faith with will be your family. That's actually more difficult than you might imagine. What is it for me? Like, because I work and I get paid by the church, work for me is, in a sense, not difficult. But the days I drive a bus as a volunteer, how do I be Jesus' person on the bus, you know, where people don't play this game the same as I do? And those things are really interesting for me. And so the challenges you listed were things like, how do we play this at work or in the classroom, you know, beyond the Sunday environment?
My dear Phil, and for your congregation, is to say, let's not look at Sunday here. Sunday's irrelevant. What I'm looking at is beyond that. And that's what I'm looking at, the classroom, as you say, the workplace. I even challenge, because I've got a reasonable, mature congregation. What are you doing in your retirement village where you live? What is your discipleship into that community? It's so easy to be a disciple on a Sunday morning among other disciples. But boy, you step out of that comfort zone, outside the gate, and you say, what now? And I think, Phil, that's my heart and my desire for Lent this year, is that we will do just that and tell people about the wonderful sacrifice of Christ Jesus, because that's the good news, that he took upon him the sin of the world.
The language that we use even within our Sunday environment is a bit like, for me, I'm not a cricket fan. Yeah. And I sit there and I try to get it, and they talk about silly mid-wicket and down in the gully and offside, and I go, I don't understand this. And there are people who don't understand Christianese.
Correct.
And the way we speak and our Sunday talk needs to be, you know, even when we say gospel, well, what is good news? How does that fit? We're kind of running a bit for time, but I wanted to just touch on something briefly. Sure. As I looked at that verse that you had chosen to focus on, I went back a little bit. And Mark, of course, does the Reader's Digest version of the gospel.
Absolutely.
There'll be people who won't even get that analogy. What was the Reader's Digest? But anyway, the condensed version. But I think there are 3 things that jump out. So, for instance, Mary of Magdala comes to the disciples and says, Jesus is alive, and they did not believe her.
Yep.
The couple who were on the way to Emmaus, according to Mark, came back to tell the disciples Jesus was alive, and they did not believe him. And then when they encountered him for themselves, some of them still did not believe. And the way Matthew tells it, even when they get to that point of him saying, I'm handing over to you, I want you to do this, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Is that incredibly encouraging for me, or could it be that even in the times when I struggle with this stuff, when I really have my doubts, Jesus says, that's okay, I am alive, and I still want you to tell the good news to the whole creation.
I think you said it. We all doubt. There's no doubt in my heart to know that how often I doubt and how often I feel like, am I losing my faith? But then I hear the words of Jesus, and I'll be with you to the end of age, or I'll be. And it's interesting to think about it, that when they use words like that, actually Jesus said, if you read the simple original language, it says, now remember, I'm with you always. Now remember. He doesn't use all the other words that we use in English. He used that, now remember. And I think he says to us, even in your faith, now remember, I'm with you, but you need to proclaim the gospel and the good news, irrespective of where you are. You might be sitting at a low level where you have no faith, but you still need to proclaim the good news, because it might be good news for other people. But I have come to know, Phil, that as I proclaim the good news, how it encourages me to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I'm back. And I think that's the Christian life for me quite often.
There's so much in that, and we could go for a long time.
Absolutely.
Folks, if you're thinking back and there's something ringing a little bell for you in the Sabbath series we've just finished, remember the Sabbath. And I'll bet that's exactly the same language that Jesus is using there. Remember, I'm with you. It's not just, oh, I remember that, like it's in my diary. It's, I remember. Yes, I remember. Yes, this is part of who I am, and it's part of my story, and I can't forget it. And there it is. And I love the way when he says, in Matthew's way of doing this, he says, as you go, just tell them what I've told you.
Yeah.
Tell them what you know. Oh.
And it goes well. And I think that's the thing, in communion, we use the same words, do this in remembrance of me. If you look at Matthew scripture, where it talks, behold, that's actually not the right word. The right words actually in that passage is now remember. And I think for us, as little or as much as we know, Jesus just wants you to tell what you know. You don't have to be a theologian to go out and to proclaim the good news. You need this much to proclaim the good news. And people will understand that much, and they will come to salvation just because you were prepared to be a disciple and to walk that journey of discipleship. Willie,
thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate it. And we are enjoying, we're loving this Lent series, and it's good to hear the perspectives and the voices from around the traps. Every blessing to your folks on the Downs from us at Bells.
So Bells from the Central Downs, blessings to you, and enjoy Lent, and we look forward to have a chat again, Phil.